I understand a few folks have a few comments today was either a marathon or an ordeal, and it was like running the gauntlet through the program. So we'll hopefully find some entertainment for everybody, as well as some knowledge today. And as my standard rule, I'm up here to have a good time for me. Hopefully y'all will continue, y'all will decide to participate as well as learn something along the way. But the only thing I can control is whether I have a good time. So we'll give it a shot. And the context of what we're looking here is really, I've referred to it as operations risk. We've come up through discussions today and a little bit yesterday about risk assessment, master planning, what's your plan, what's your risk, how do you get from point A to point B? And in the context of risk assessment, what we're going to talk about here, it's risk is risk. There's financial risk, there's physical security risk, cyber risk, operations risk, safety risk, healthcare risk, all sorts of elements. And when you start blending them in a holistic pattern and start tying in all of these other aspects, now you get a much better context upon which to work. And what I'll throw out here are, sort of the objectives. What are some of the practical considerations? And some of those considerations are probably going to be some that, well, I'll share the ones that I've learned the hard way. Some of them I try to learn the easy way. But from a little bit of my perspective, and as we go, I'll explain a little bit of how we got there. But my career started just down the road at Sandia National Laboratories. That's where I learned to assess risk, and that was in the context of national security assets, was designing systems to protect nuclear weapons, and so we decided we would run risk to see what it was to try and go again, take advantage of weaknesses in the process, in the program. And even though we were talking about the physical security of those assets, it was truly the operation that you had to assess. That you looked at specific characteristics. So that whole context here, we're tying in more aspects. We'll talk some about cyber as well, and how all of those play. But the main characteristics are the same. So, and I've led, operated assessments from a broad scale of one guy with an opinion going out to a site and giving some feedback, to leading a team of 10 people overseas for 2 straight weeks, doing a whole integrated system across Angola and Colombia, and a whole host of others. So with the exception of Antarctica, I've been out there playing with them. Different methodologies. Some of them are, they will fall in on the same basic context. But the keys up on the overview that we need to address is, before you even start, you have to set up what is that assessment. What are you trying to achieve and why? And if you don't do that right, then you'll have window dressing. You'll have issues that come in. And as we've gone through here, we've run assessments, we've developed up software to run assessments. In going through that process, we've learned a lot of things we thought were right, learned where those weaknesses are, and I'll be sharing a lot of those weaknesses and some of the paths to try and improve and make those better as we've gone to improve our system and our product. But as with any project, if you're designing a project, if you're doing an assessment, what's going to define the success of that assessment? Had a discussion just last week. We've got a company that we're working with, just started their engagement. They have a visit coming in by the TSA in the middle of December. And of course, when the feds show up for a scheduled visit, which they're not calling an audit, but it is for their regulated program, they decided to go up and look under the TSA handbook for pipelines and what's required to pass this audit. And they figured out that an SVA was required. So their objective between now and December 19th is to perform an SVA that will pacify the inspector enough to where they can continue their program and develop up a more mature program. So is there quality of data in there that's important to them? Not really. It's making sure they can check the box. So they get to think about that over the weekend. But that's one objective. You have others you want to bring in. We'll keep with the regulator framework, because when we talk about going through that risk and looking at threats, well, who are your biggest threats most of the time? If you were in Sal's presentation earlier, it was regulators. If we were in the big data program earlier, one of the others came up was attorneys. In my opinion, that represents about 95% of the threats, sometimes higher, that everyone's going to be living with. There are really bad guys out there that do stuff that you have to work with, and there's operations risks and the like, but those are big threats that come in. So ask these questions of yourself. Are you doing it for yourself? Are you doing it to improve your business operation? Are you trying to improve one aspect, or are you looking at your full enterprise? All of these come in to where you're gonna come in and determine what are the questions to ask, how do you get there? Earlier today as well, the point of stakeholders, and I think that was in the program of, is your program going to be a success or a fiasco? And the more you open up looking at what you want to achieve, you start identifying who the stakeholders are that you're going to have to be addressing, both to capture data from and to present analyzed results to. And if you miss, and you don't want to miss either of those. How are you going to collect your data? Is it automated? Is it manual? Is it going to be personnel based? Do I have to train up a pool of experts to be able to perform this assessment? Do I want to make sure that I can go a lowest common denominator and still achieve that? That's going to change how you're going to define that program. And then how are you going to use your results? If you can pick that in, and we'll go into some more details as we go into those results later, but are those results going to be an online presentation that are dynamic, or is it static, just one point in time? That's going to be a big change. Is it something that you're using as a building block for the assessment and the results? To where, and I'll take the pipeline example. Discussion with Pemex, 15,000 kilometers of pipeline. Well, they were interested in understanding what the risk was on certain pipeline sections. They were also interested in risk of their pump stations. They were interested in risk of their maintenance and support facilities. They were interested in wellhead risk, as well as delivery terminals. Now, that's a whole big piece to bite out at one time. So their program was to be able to assess it one piece at a time, but then to roll up and get results. They were expecting and looking for a systematic, system-wide assessment. Very different than just looking at, I've got my 1,500 pump stations and I have the risk for each one and identify which ones are critical. It may be that I have a pool of 10 and none of them are critical, but together they represent a critical asset to me because of their interconnections. So that understanding allows you to start that discussion. And then you run into, you figured out what success is. Additional details are what are the scope? Is it just physical security? A lot of folks in this room, how many of y'all have gone beyond physical security in doing a risk assessment? How many of you have only done physical security assessments? So we've got a mix in there. The rules are not always the same. When we get into some of the challenges we'll talk about there. And they also have a broad scope and spectrum. A physical security assessment, the ones I've done, anything from, and I know the folks that I've, with the Secret Service, well, now and others, that's a lot of personnel-based assessment versus physical site assessment. Then you've got, with whether it be physical or cyber, I'm talking about information assessment. Well, that information sometimes are ones and zeros, and they're sitting on physical hardware inside physical rooms. Sometimes that's information sitting just on paper and how we're managing it that way. Or it's verbal. It's just audible. It's a point capture in time. So my assessment there is, can I eavesdrop real time is my concern. There's no long-standing record. Business operations. The way we run our business and our perspective is, if the business is impacted and the business doesn't run, I don't really care if you've protected your physical assets or your cyber assets or your communication systems or anything else in there. If the business is gone or the people are gone that run that business and you can't continue to operate, then the rest is is really a moot point. Are you going to tie in safety concerns, environmental concerns, spills, trip and fall, if you've got confined space issues, and so now I'm looking at the risk of are people going, am I putting them at risk? Am I going into a class 1 div 1 or a class 1 div 2 type of environment where asphyxiation or explosion will come into play? Am I looking at an all hazards assessment where I'm including nature? I moved from having to worry about hurricanes and flooding to now I just enjoyed a 3-inch snowfall last week. And so to me, when it gets below 60 degrees, the Carhartt comes on. So I look like, when it gets down to freezing, I'm already looking like the Michelin Man from old. So all y'all that enjoy and live that stuff, I can be the bad example all the time. It's really one of my strengths. And are you talking about the same way of your scope considerations? Are you looking at short-term assessments of nature events? Am I looking at, I want to find out when earthquakes come in, or flash fires. Flash fires now, I've got a few more days to work with rather than I don't know when it's going to happen if it's the earthquake, but I know aftershocks are going to keep coming in. So am I looking to scope out my assessments so that I can do a quick turn and I can continue to update it? Or am I just looking at the average events of my probability? So we've already talked a bit about system-wide or site-specific. And then the big difference is, are you scoping those together or one at a time? And that interconnection is the change. The one that it comes up is, are you looking at really just your assets and your protection measures and your operations that are internal to your owned facility? So if you've got a fence line or a campus, are you looking at just what's in there, or are you looking at the feedstock that you don't even necessarily own or control? If your system relies, if you're in the chemicals or the refining business, if you don't have nitrogen to blanket an operation, you've got a big problem. So if I want to take out your facility, I'll take out the nitrogen pipeline, and you're going to have to shut down because of safety reasons. If I combine that with something else, I can really mess up your world. If I want to take out a city operation, I take out the natural gas pipeline in. Because as soon as you fix it, that's great, but I've got all those pilot lights that I have to operationally look to. So now that comes back into that business operations piece of resiliency. What's my resiliency of operation? Security risk assessments are fun if you're a security guy. If you're the CEO of a company that actually does something, instead of just providing a service, which is what security is a service, then I'm looking at the resiliency of my business. And we're just one piece or play of that. And then if I go through and I've figured out I want to address, like I said, the internal and the external pieces about like the pipelines or the other infrastructure, personnel, traffic being able to, and roadways being able to get to me, or that combination, what am I going to do if I can't get to everything I need or want in the assessment that will achieve my success criteria? So the example, I have an assessment. I'm looking at an information protection assessment. That's the critical piece of the success is I've got trade secrets, I've got other operations. What's important? The scope that I'm allowed to perform is just looking at the physical side of the equation. I can look at IDF rooms, I can look at server rooms, I can look at all the equipment, everything in there, but my scope doesn't, the IT guys, no matter how they spell IT, we have IT, they have got companies that call it IT, TO, BS, ICS. I like BS1, that was one of my favorites. But everyone's got to share the love. So what are you going to do if that's not allowed? If you can't include that in your assessment, because those folks, they look at you as a knuckle dragger because you're the physical security guy, and they're the propeller heads, and so never the two shall meet. So how are you going to address that and still provide a deliverable that says, for information protection, here are your risks? I can give you the approach that's pretty cool. I get my percussion moved in there. Beatbox, there we go, yeah. Like I said, this is all about me. You guys are welcome to come for the ride. So if you can't define where your limits are in your scope, in a means that you can at least trigger the questions that can move into the decision makers to say, to achieve success, this is as far as we can go. This is our point of demarcation. And we are expecting to be able to fully get to success, someone else is going to have to answer these questions and address these issues of scope. And that's where you take back to at least get that discussion moving. And it may not increase your scope right now, but at least you've identified, you've done your part of the project and puzzle to know where, it's a flat earth world. Well, that's where the world drops off to where I can't see it, but I know it's there. Because as much as, and somebody said earlier, the customer's always right, I disagree. The customer is always the customer, whether you're internal or you're external. The customer is always the customer, and what we can do is we can't tell them to give us more money unless we want to do it for free and do all this stuff as a hobby, which personally can be fun for a short period of time, but it sucks after a while, because homeless came up earlier in discussions, and So what can we do to at least identify the issues and bring them up in a manner that is honorable, ethical, and opens up to where other folks can start filling in that block. So now we step in, and if y'all want to discuss, we got the microphone, or if it's you just can't, you got ants in your pants and you can't stop, I'll try and repeat the question so we can keep moving. But process challenges. If you're running through and you're doing an assessment, you figured out how we're going to get and move things through. Some of the things that you need to address up front, and like I said, we've learned several of these the hard way over 30 years, plus or minus. Data collection. How are you going to collect your data? Is it going to be that you've got a cadre of people that are going to go out and they're going to look at every site, and they're going to spend, you're going to a large campus and you've got a week dedicated. You're walking around, you're interviewing people, you're taking pictures, you're working through, and so that's going to take time. That's going to take a lot of logistics and interaction to get people engaged. And how am I going to get, or am I going to do that through surveys that I'm sending out online or manually? What's my criteria for making sure I get all those back? And then repeatability of results. If I go look at a site, and I came out of, when I was at Exxon, I led security engineering for them for 8.5 years. So when I go look at a refinery or refinery complex, or even an upstream location, I'm looking at a wellhead site, I've got a lot of experiences of what that business, how that business operates, what's the geology issues, what are the operations. I grew up in the oil field with family. So if I do that, I'm going to get a different perspective than Howard Belfour is going to have, because he comes from a different perspective. He may be just as adept as I am with physical security issues, with cybersecurity issues, with the process of risk assessment, but because there's a different context there, that repeatability of results is going to be different. If I'm giving a survey and I put out the survey, how am I going to qualify the results of that survey so I get repeatable results? And if I'm doing this and I want to do an enterprise for an operation across the globe, and we had one that was operating in 120 countries, and they wanted to do all of their sites in 3 years. Well, they certainly weren't going to pay my company to do that and to fly us all around the globe. And every place that you go is interesting the first time, but there's some of them when you go back, it's really not of interest. And in the oil and gas business, I got to visit a lot of those. So so that's really a challenge, is how you're going to collect that data in a repeatable process. And that's truly what's killed a lot of the programs. The automated systems and tools we get done. So, and how am I going to manage? So as we move into managing that process, you're managing assets, you're managing resources. And is that a repeatable process? How can I take from my single site and move it up to larger sites? If I'm in critical infrastructure, there's some sites that are regulated. They have to be assessed every year, or every 3 years, or every 7 years. Do I want to start from scratch every time? That's a rough order and an expensive order. So how are you going to manage that so you collect the data in a repeatable fashion? You can update that data over time and go and know what's solid, what needs to be changed, and then if you don't have a repeatable, manageable process to do that, you're starting over every single time. And now, the fact that we've done that assessment, the first time the assessment, it was the first one that your team had ever looked at this type of business unit. Now you've looked at that type of business unit for 3 years. You're seeing different things. So if you did that first assessment with your skill set today versus 3 years ago, it's going to be different. So that repeatability continues to come up. And some other pieces that we run into when I'm looking at my model. How am I going to make my calculations? And I want to jump over, and then we'll come back to a couple things. When I start looking at a risk process, this was just a short survey that I did. Some things that I know and that I use, some things that I picked up from others, but when I ask for a risk equation, and folks talk about their risk and their risk equation, it's all over the map. And I mean, if you notice, there's, okay, risk and threat and vulnerability. Super. Where's my asset? Okay, well, I've got a threat. I've got a bad guy with the universal key lock, so he's got bolt cutters. And my vulnerability is I've got padlocks all over my place. Well, so what? If I got a fence with 18 padlocks and they're all interconnected, and one, I only have to open one padlock to get in. But two is, if the fence is empty, if there's nothing inside the fence, what's my risk? So then I've got my probability and vulnerability. Well, you would hope that they would say that's the probability of the successful application of an attack, not necessarily the probability of an attack, because if a 2-year-old attacks your truck, that's probably a little different than if it's a really agitated 16-year-old with a pipe wrench. Probability and impact, now we're getting a little closer, assuming that your impact is impact on an asset or an asset group, and that's a probability of a successful compromise or a successful attack. Now, threat vulnerability, I mean, it comes through. Then when we start getting to a regular equation, risk is the probability of attack, times 1 minus the probability of a successful intercept, times the consequence. That comes out of the Department of Energy model. That model, if you look at the way they apply it for an SVA, they assume that the probability of attack is 1. That's their design basis. So they've already changed up. They change up the map because it's a different way of applying it. The other is, if you step down, now I'm going to summarize all my individual risks of the likelihood of attack and the probability that that attack will be successful, and I'm going to roll up all of the different ways that can occur, down to bringing in cost, a whole host of other issues. So now, which equation do you want to use? If you are part of the NIST family, and we take it out of NIST, they don't care what process. You just need to use one, pick it, stay consistent, and everything's great. So the challenge, and this is, I just pick on NIST because it's one that's easy to find, easy to reference in discussion, but this is almost any of the federal agencies. Some of them it's a little different. Even you get into CFATs and their programs, you can have asset-based, you can have scenario-based assessments. And so all of your different elements come in, which runs back down to the model valuation that I'm going to use. Now that I have a model that I have there and I've got my equation, I'm a believer that the equation basis starts with the very simple piece of I have to have an asset, so there's a consequence of that asset being lost. I have to have a threat, and there's a probability that that threat is going to be successful because it can exploit a vulnerability. But if I don't, so I've got to factor in all of those aspects. If I don't have a threat, all I do is I look at vulnerability. And the vulnerability of someone the vulnerability of my truck with the windows down and the keys inside of it, it's full of gas and it's running, the vulnerability that it could be driven off is really great. The fact is, if it's surrounded by a moat full of alligators and there's no people anywhere close, the risk is pretty small because it's probably going to run out of gas before anyone's going to get over there and get to it. The fact that I drive a diesel truck, that's a little different, so it's not ever going to run out of gas. But that model, the element that we run into is the model you're using. You've got an equation that you're using, and if you've got perfect data to run on that equation, you can calculate up risk. When you're looking at the probability of attack, is that a certainty when you come up with an answer, or are you coming up with a scale or some other factor? Rating fatigue. How many of y'all took the SAT? When you didn't know the answer, which was the one that you usually used? C or D. C or D. Yep. Well, there's an interesting, in fact, the rating fatigue, there's a number of studies that come in, and I've got a chart and we'll go a little more, but and then this one, we pulled together our automated system, and that you could use to calculate up and get up to enterprise risk. What we found is rating fatigue is, even with folks that are experts in their field, the variability in results, when you start asking the similar questions, folks get tired. And so most of the answers came in on a 5-point scale at a 3 or a 4 early in the process. Later in the process, you'd get more 1s and 5s because it's like, well, I've got 5 options. I probably ought to use them every once in a while, and I'm kind of feeling guilty because all the numbers are converging at the same place. And that's proven out on a number of issues. That became a real challenge. I'll hold off, just a placeholder for gerrymandering of your rating system and output matrix, and we'll talk about that. when we get into the matrix. Data and process normalization. This is really where you start crossing over from more than just one assessment. You start going, here's my physical, and I've got safety, cyber, what have you. Everybody's got their own scale. If you're looking at hurricanes, typhoons, tornado scales, if I'm coming in on dollar scales, when I start looking at my data, and if I've got my IT team and they're doing a cyber assessment, and I have my physical team and they're doing the physical assessment, and hopefully I'm crossing over in that process, but the fact is that they answer things on a different rating and a different scale than I do. And it's hard to get those to match up because it's trying to compare that apples to oranges. So if you don't understand your data and you don't have it defined well, you can't combine various assessments. And if you're going to do a combined assessment, and I want to utilize the results of a cyber assessment that's been performed, I better understand all of that data there and bring it in. And and convert it, normalize it. And one of the examples when I was at Exxon that was really great, we did assessments all over the globe, captured all the data, brought it in, and reported it as an enterprise fashion on a quarterly basis. And at that time, I was going in and out of Colombia because the FARC and the ELN were very active. I worked with folks that were marked for assassination, and we had bombings that were going on a weekly basis to the infrastructure. But when we looked at the risk and we brought it in, the risk profile for the UK was equal to the risk profile for Colombia. And the reason was because the data was brought in, the fact is that people were stealing so many car washes in UK that they accumulated all their loss from every car wash and said, well, gosh, for a C-store, the loss of $1,000 a month is really significant in our bottom line just from stolen car washes. And in Colombia, shoot, that was like 9:30 to 9:45 on Tuesday morning was we lost $1,000 of supplies and lost opportunity. So, but the data wasn't normalized, but it all was going into the same system and the same process. And everyone was doing their best job, but the guys that were sitting in a low threat area, they wanted to pump up to make it look like they were important and that they had a really important job to do. And the folks in Colombia, if you didn't lose $10,000 worth of stuff, it didn't even make it was noise. So that's where things would get gerrymandered. Expert advice, assessor expertise, that's the bias. Here's my background, here's my knowledge. And when we come in, we're the folks that say, well, I'm an independent consultant, I don't promote in one product or another. Well, that's BS. You promote what you know. You don't promote what you don't know because you're not even exposed to it. So how can you be completely independent? And you're going to promote in trying to be as ethical and honorable as you can to your clients. You're going to promote what you have the highest confidence is going to be successful for them. That doesn't mean that something else can't be equally as helpful, but you aren't going to promote it. And in the same way, it can be one of the considerations maybe as an accepted alternate if you can convince me. But why would you be so stupid to go in where I know this is going to work, these might, and promote them equally? And I think that's a challenge that comes in here as to what you know, what you look for. And if you get someone that's used to traveling overseas all the time into crap holes of the world, they're not going to be as worried about certain things that a newbie is going to be worried about when they go over there, because you just get used to it. You kind of get into a lull. Politics and trust. Do you understand the internal politics? Are you going to ask the right questions and give the right answers? I think, Jerry, you mentioned today, you got to walk that line when you're working for both the architect and the end user. So, or you're working for this division versus the other. And is the company that you're working with, do they trust you enough to give you all the results? And do you trust them enough to give them all the data? And do you trust them enough to give back without skewering your job? Because we did an assessment and went into it was $100,000 project, multi-day, big scope effort on site, large campus. We went in and showed them halfway through the process how we could take $2 billion worth of product from their warehouse. They were a $12 billion a year company. We could take $2 billion of product that could be fenced for at least 25% the value and have them loaded in the trucks for us and do it within a 4-hour time frame. When we showed them how we could do that, they said, "Thank you very much. I never want you to write this down. Your contract is terminated. We don't want to hear any more." So they paid us the rest of it, but they wanted us gone. They didn't want to know the fact that we just pantsed them and used their people to do the job. And we didn't, and anybody can do stuff with explosives and weapons and guns. We just talked our way into their critical facility, and I was talking to the guard while I was watching on video where my friend was going around using a broken pallet on the side to start triggering the initial indicators, and then the whole process just started. So, and then tools. What tools are you going to use? There's a whole host of tools. There's a whole host of programs and methodologies that are out there. I'll start with the as-is methodology. Well, I'm going to start poking holes in it in a minute, but it's one representative of a whole bunch of others that I can use a tool. I can use Word and Excel and do it. I can use, there's other software systems that will sell you to do the exact same thing, and all they do is just organize your own information. Maybe that's all you need. And you do all the analysis, you bring on all the smarts, and you do it. There are other tools that are going to make calculations for you. Have those calculations been validated? Do you have confidence that if I put in this input, it's going to give me this output every time reliably? And, oh, by the way, in reality, if that incident occurs, do I get the same predicted output from this system? And if I'm just going on trust, then have I really? But I don't have anything to back it up. Then what have you got? I can go back to the same tool. So if you're going to use an automated tool that's going to do calculations for you, then make sure that you've got that you have due diligence on that system and validation that it does function, and you know why and how that it gets there. Especially as you get into more complex calculations where you're bringing in the probability, the likelihood that a threat is going to even care about you. The threat source is that threat source can carry out an attack, that threat source can direct it towards you, that there's a history of that engaged, that you've got the asset characterized properly, you've got the vulnerability, you have other factors that are weighed in. So shifting gears just a little bit as to very common, and while we'll talk about the risk matrix and how things are presented. Here's one example, and it's the scoring method. The scoring methods, how many of y'all use scoring methods of some sort when you do assessments? Almost every system I've seen with very, very few, and that was when I was in the DOE world, used scoring systems, and even the scoring systems there, they would move to some scoring level because they had to make assumptions. You only have so much data from which to work. So I work all these up. I've got my frequency, my probability of occurrence. Mark, what's frequent probability?
Depends, right? Depends on how you want to scale it for.
It's here on the matrix. What is it? What is it? It's 5.
Definition, right?
Okay, well, all right, so what's your definition?
I'll shoot it. Frequent is once a month.
Once a month. Okay, cool. Mine is 1. It's probability of 1. I'm doing a 1-year assessment, and yours is once a month, so now yours is 12. But my probability goes from 0 to 1, yours goes from 0 to 12. So it's all going to change. So now I do another, but right now I say, okay, let's just assume that probability is linear. I have 20%, 0 to 20%, 20 to 40, 40 to 60, and on up. Okay, maybe that's good. In the nuclear weapons world, it was a logarithmic scale. So it was, is this up to, and that was, as well as on severity, we were at logarithmic scale. Now that chart starts changing a whole bunch because catastrophic for a C-store is a $50,000 loss or a $100,000 loss. I've totally taken that C-store out of business. Yet, at the chemical refinery, a $100,000 loss is, I've got a $10 million turnaround that's going to happen next week. My $100,000 loss is important, but it's in the marginal range. So I start changing those around. This is another matrix. Now, if you notice on the other one, the one previously, bad stuff was on the upper left. Here, bad stuff is on the upper right. Does it matter? If you're consistent, it doesn't matter. Some people really get spun up on it one way or the other, but you got to establish a standard. Now this one, it's pretty small. Here, when you start looking at the consequence, and they also flipped the axes, consequence, their extreme consequence is greater than $500 million loss. So that's score, in that score level, that's a score of 9, greater than 500 million. So if I lost $8 billion, it's still a score of 9.
And it's only money.
It's only money. If I have, and I start working down, minor is less than $10 million. So I could lose a whole bunch of my C-stores and it's still minor, I don't even care. Moderate is 10 to 25 million. So the difference between a level 1 and a level 2 is $15 million. Whereas the difference between a level 8 and a level 9 is 250 million. So I've gerrymandered my process. It's not logarithmic, it's not linear, it's arbitrary, and if you start looking through, it's inconsistent. So if I want to manage and gerrymander my results, all I have to do is start gerrymandering my numbers and tags on the other side. Likely and unlikely, very rare, less than 0.01%. They're at a logarithmic scale through the first 3 levels, and then all of a sudden it goes 10% to 50% likelihood, and then 50 to 90% likelihood. So nothing is consistent. So I can gerrymander anything that I want with the exact same information. If I'm not consistent, it's not going to be there. And if I'm guessing on my probabilities, Mark's probability is once a month. Okay, well, once a month, this is going to occur on a 1-year basis. Well, then that's greater than 90% probability. But but yet 50 to 90%, if I said, well, it's once a month, but is it going to be every month? What if it's only 3/4 of the months in that year? Well, now it's already dropped way down. So that's where you have to make sure you understand your model and you understand that it's all proper. But the real key that comes in is the error bands are not consistent. And what we found in our process is that when people start scoring, they score what they think the answer is, but their error band can be significant. It can be even 15, 20% of that range. That works great when it's a single point that you're addressing. But you start multiplying 2, 3, or 4 different factors in those equations, and now your error band is larger than your complete span of your entire risk matrix. So what that does is it puts everything in the middle when you start scoring it out. So we'll get a little more there. Score definitions. This is one that was set. This actually came from a Carver assessment. I've used it with others. Number 3, recent credible threats against this type of asset. If I asked, there's how many people in here? 20? What's your probability that if I gave the same event of recent credible threats against this type of asset means that I had one credible threat that I determined was credible because I had 2 people tell me that this guy really doesn't like me and this guy has tended to do bad stuff in the past, and that somebody told me that 2 years ago. Well, and it happened right near me. Would that be a level 3 or a level 2? How many would say level 3? How many would say level 2? How many of y'all are awake? How many of y'all care? Let's try this again. Okay, here we go. We have, within the last 2, we have one, I know everything because I'm up front, so of course I know everything. So now, I know everything, and I said, this is a credible threat against your asset within the last 2 years. So is it going to be historically common against this type of asset, occurred in the past, general threat against this type? Is it going to be 4, 3, or 2? Who wants to go for 4? Okay, 0. 1. Who's going to go for 3? 4. Who's going to go for 2? Now we're about 8. Okay, anybody want to go for 1? Okay, we got troublemakers because you double voted. Vote early, vote often. Yep. I know which political party y'all work for. Okay. So now you realize that I moved from Texas to right next to the People's Republic of Boulder. So, which one have I gone with, my old life or my new life with that answer? You're going to have to figure it out. So, but okay, so here's, even in this, with that, we've got a defined point. You've got different answers that come out. And this is kind of a cheesy example, but it's real, of the interpretation of whether it is a language difference or a cultural difference or geographical difference, educational difference. You're going to interpret those differently. So let's take a different example. Let's define all of our characteristics in much more detail. Have I fixed the problem or have I made it worse?
Can't tell.
Who's going to know?
Okay?
Nobody's going to read it.
I think you're correct in a lot of ways. In some ways, I've made it better. Because what I've done is I've provided more detail to hone in everyone to try and get to the same agreement on what the verbiage is, what the words are, with more examples, and they start taking things out. What else have I made it more difficult? I've got more rating fatigue involved because I have a lot more that I have to work with. And you get back to the code talkers thing of, well, the Navajo folks, they were really fast because they had a small set that they worked with, and so they could get it done in 2 minutes, where the guys that went through and they had to crunch through all of the different options took them 4 hours. They may get the similar result. So there's no right answer or wrong. This is where you get scoring is the problem. And so how do you fix that in a scoring system? Well, you don't use a scoring system, but that's a problem. So these are some of those issues. The range compression, that's where the dollars changed or the frequency changed. It's the difference between a score of a 1, 2, or 3 is not consistent and predictable across your whole span. If everything, you can say, well, is it consistent if it's logarithmic? Well, it's logarithmically predictable, but my differences where you run into, and I'll show you, and the ways around this are, scoring works well when you're dealing with your results. Until you get to the results level, then dealing with raw data gives you a lot of additional advantages. And so your presumption, and when you're common intervals, folks think in terms of common intervals. Well, they're not. And the presumption of independence. Here's the great one. I have I'm scoring the inherent protection for my asset. So I've got a building, and I've got a building that's reinforced concrete walls, and I have an access control system that's embedded, and I have other features that are just part of that, and it happens to be in a rather isolated location, so I've got some natural features there. Okay, so I'm going to give an inherent protection rating for that building. Do I incorporate my access control as part of that? What if it's a crappy access control system and I want to add a new one? What if and so what do I put in and rate as part of the asset and part of the protection? So one of my assets for my campus is I've got my building and I have a guard building and a fence around it. Is my guard building an asset, or is it a protection measure? Or is it both? If I start scoring them up and they're independent, and my people, I have my people now, they're an asset, but they are also my response force. Am I counting both of those twice? There is a dependence. If I don't have the people, I don't have my protection force. And if I lose the people, if I lose half the people, did I lose the ones that are protection force or not? Am I going to be able to run through that consistently with all of my assessors and get something that's there reliably? That's going to be a challenge. Here's what I got on that the range compression, what we run into. This was, I took out for some research, this was where the scores came in with experts rating on seven different assessing the same thing seven times. The gray is the range they applied, and everything just really went to 4 as they came through, but it still had a lot of different variability in there, because you're talking variability of 20 or over 20% in the results from folks who are supposed to be experts. So is everybody on your team that you're going to use an assessment equally an expert? I wish that was the case. Precision versus accuracy in a couple of different ways. I'm really accurate here at the wrong target, but I'm precise on the wrong target. I am locked in, but I'm always hitting the wrong thing. Which one of these is worse? Would I rather have this or have that?
One on the upper right, because it's recoil anticipation, and you can correct.
I think the one on top.
If you correct, what if you're not? But see, the reason you did that was you didn't know you needed to correct.
Right.
So you just screwed up every single time consistently, but you were really good. Yeah. So, yeah, okay.
That's where you go in and you don't expect to walk in
Okay.
the range and do the one in the lower right, the lower right.
Okay, so let me recall. Let me make sure I try and capture, because that was a really great story, John. Thanks for helping me on that one. That was good there. So really, okay. So this one is postulated. This is the best one because it is so repeatable. I can correct for it because I'm smart enough to know it's the recoil, and I just keep shooting in the wrong place. That's awesome, as long as I know and I can see the target. But if I don't see the target, all I see is this, that says I got groupthink and everybody is just as stupid all the time, consistently. Whereas these folks here, the collective sense, groupthink is right. Individually, they're mediocre. These folks, man, they're all over the map. Who knows? But the average, actually, I would say the average of that comes closer into the center. So it's actually pretty similar in accuracy as down to here. We can also look, for really the math nerds in the system, you can look at the curves. I like shooting stuff, so I could go with that one. But here, if we go back to the key of, I would much rather have this if I go through the effort of validating my model. This gives me the way to evaluate my model and fix it. This gives me a way to evaluate my process and fix my process, because I have accuracy in there, and my process is what's giving me off. And if I start running and validating the tool that I'm using, it gives me one or the other. So but it's until you validate your model and you go back and step back, and I would say it's rare in my experience, both in the assessments that I've performed, as well as the ones that I've seen others do and read and researched with. There's very few folks and organizations even, as an example, NIST as others, TSA, DHS, that go back and they verify that their model is correct and validate that. It's Deloitte, they have their own thing because they put a name on it and market it. That's their process. Any company here that does their own process, you mark it up. That's what makes me unique. Well, but which one do you have? If you don't know it, unless you test it, you don't know where you are in any of those. You may be right, but if you come through and say, everyone comes out with the same answer, you're either collectively wrong, or maybe you're collectively right. But if this is your deliverable and you're taking this to the CEO of an organization going to make millions or more dollars of a decision, and you can't tell them which one you are, I'm either telling you to run off the road and die, or I'm telling you to make 18 gajillion dollars. If I can't discriminate that, am I giving them good advice?
So Ben, the one on the upper left,
Okay, the one on the upper left. This was the one you want to talk about?
you kind of take a look and go, I need to do a reset. I need to hit the reset button. I need to ask the question a different way. Something that, when you get that much statistical variation, it means probably everybody that read that, nobody understood.
So I think, the point being, if everything is all over the map and nothing converges, I've got both a process issue as well as a competence issue of my personnel. I need to address both. And this is one of my best indicators that I'm out picking daisies somewhere, but this gives me more information than any of the others. The only difference is that the difference between this one and this one is if I don't understand my scale well, I can't discriminate these. So the point I'm trying to really make is that if you're going to do assessments, and we'll get into, and I think we're still okay on time. But the point I'm really trying to make is, thank you. Unless you know where you sit on there, I can see that I'm spread out, I can see that I'm collected. But until I can see where it fits on that target, I would suggest you need to do one of two things. Either you need to throw all this hogwash away and say, I am providing a security review, not a risk assessment. I'm providing a security review based on my experience and knowledge, and I'm going to come through and tell you my opinion as a smart, experienced individual, and I'm giving you my opinion for you to consider. And I'm going to do that a whole lot less expensively, so I'm not going to make as much money, and my marketing guys aren't going to be so happy, and as the business owner, I may not be as happy. Or I go through and I find out where I understand the target, and I verify my process, and I validate the validity. Validate the validity? That's pretty cool. That's almost like a second semester word. This is just the one I use twice. So I'm going to validate that my process has integrity, it is repeatable, and it has statistical background and a real life basis upon which to make those kind of decisions. Otherwise, you're just living in that middle ground. So if you're going to go ahead and have fun and get your wife pregnant, go ahead and let her take it to term so you can have a child. If you keep her 7 months pregnant forever, she's probably not going to like you a whole bunch. So the same way you come in on what you're doing, if you're saying you're going to provide value, come in and go for what your confidence based on what you bring to the table, and define those limits and deliver your opinion, your professional opinion. If you're going to claim you're going to do a very detailed analysis of the risk, then you need to up the game more than just using a tool that says, I'm taking my opinion, I'm putting it in a nice framework that I can put a brand tag on it, and I'm gonna tag my scores on it, but I'm not ever gonna validate them. Then my personal belief is that's why we have hard time selling the value of our services and making people accept them more than just they trust our opinion, because they're trusting what we bring in as the opinion. I can bring that in as an opinion-based assessment. If I'm going to bring that in as a systematic-wide application, I better validate my system. And now I go from one extreme to the other and provide a whole lot of value that is significantly different. I'm not trying to run this sort of amorphous middle where I'm always having to try and convince people to be correct.
And you know what, I just realized that chart, that's like jury deliberation. The jury room in the upper left-hand corner, what you're ultimately trying to do, the jury room is trying to get everything at the lower right.
Okay.
Some thing.
You talk too much, so you have to have a mic.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
If you look at that, who else has been on a jury before?
Oh,
Anybody?
yeah. Too many times.
Too many times, okay. Upper
That's what I used to say.
left is like you walk into the jury room and nobody knows each other,
Okay.
and that's where you start. The jury foreman's job is to get everybody down to the lower right.
Well, or the jury foreman's to get them all together.
Get them all together, but
Whether it's there or there is what the lawyers are going to determine is right or wrong.
right.
So, but okay, so I think there's some legitimacy there. Just keep it, you run it around for folks. So now here's what we talked about: error bands. Especially when I'm in a scoring system and I'm making my decisions, and I'm saying, well, I have my range for loss is $500,000 to $750,000, or pick the number. Okay, so I say, well, that's a score, and so my number is 650,000. Okay, I picked that. Well, but I'm not really sure. I'm off. I could be off 100,000 either way. So it could be that I'm down here and I scored it as a 5. It could be it as a 4, but it'd be right below or just below a 6. That all works fine until I say, if you go back, if we are at our equations, we have 2 of them, we say, here's our probability of loss, and here's our consequence of loss. Most basic risk equation that there is. But here's my error bands. When I multiply the 2, these error bands multiply by each other, and they're larger than the entire span. So what I have is, and the more of those calculations I get, the more these error bands are larger, the more that whole the risk matrix would look really pretty with all the different slots and bins in there. They all converge into the middle, because that's the middle of the error band that you have left. And that was an eye-opener when we put out our first version of our product, when we went through that full data. And the process was, we went ahead and verified we could run the process consistently. It was a little difficult, but it was manageable. When we validated that unless those errors could be constrained, that the system blew up, and our range of risk from 0 to 1, our error band could go from minus 1.5 to plus 3. So everything came in as risk was, you just couldn't tell. Unless you went through a lot of effort and refinement, which made it more challenging to use. So that's the challenge when you use scores. There's ways around that. There's mathematical plays. There's other strategies to come in. We've actually come back after I filed a patent and I'll share that one with you a little more about what we came through. But the key is you verify your process to be able to get past that. We already talked about some of the intervals that are assumed. And start moving to, let's assume that you're either providing a validated process with quality data or your opinion. Some things that you need to figure out. How are you going to visualize and present your information? And are you going to go with summary or detail? A lot of times, folks, they just want to see a matrix. Put dots on the matrix, give a heat map. That was one of the examples that came up earlier. Are you going to provide, you could have the same risk like on the matrix. I can say, well, this is a uber red, yellow, blue, or green. Okay, I'll just give here's my risk. I just want to summarize and say I have, each one of these represents one of the scenario fits. So I have 15 scenarios that are in red. None are in the uber red, which means, oh my gosh, the sky is falling. Unless we fix it, the business is dead. Here we have about 3 weeks before the business is dead. These are things, the yellow we can manage. We've got 4 of them. Do we want to just see a simple scale that says, I got 15 events that are, oh my gosh, I've got to do them, and nothing that I don't have to worry about? When the reality is there's a whole bunch of these. It's just you don't worry about them usually. You don't calculate them up, but they all exist. So, and how do those play? Or do you want to discriminate against them to say, really, the reality is I have a probability of 1 that I'm going to have on a weekly basis. I'm going to lose $1,000. Do I really care? The same way, if it fits in the same thing of on an annualized basis, I can say that for a 10% chance, I'm going to lose $10,000 every month. So my numbers still come out the same. Which do I want to show? It's something that you define as part of your success criteria. Is everything universal or tailored? This is where you're starting to present. Do I present the same results to everybody? Do I present some of those results in some places? Permissions. Do I need to take, and coming back to some of Sal's privacy information, is some of the results of my assessment, are some of them, do I need to have permissions there because of privacy or regulatory, that I can only share this with the executives, I can only share this with the engineers, I can only share this internal, but I can't share it with the regulators? Or do I have one business unit because of regulatory requirements that the regulatory body says this division can only see this data, but this other division can't, because one has marketing information and one of them has technical information. How am I going to maintain the permissions and the protection of that data? Because it may not be sensitive when you're in the process of collecting it, but when you assimilate it, all it is. When I was at Sandia, I wrote a top secret report. I didn't have my security clearance yet. That was as soon as I turned it in, that was the last I saw that report until I got cleared. But boy, I got to talk to a whole bunch of investigators as to how I got all this information and wrote a top secret report. It was the assimilation of the data was the issue. So that was pretty entertaining for a while. And that comes in with the same way with your regulatory constraints. So what are the keys to success? Focus on the mission that you're trying to come up with. That's going to tell you if your expert opinion is good enough. That's going to tell you if you need to go in and really start diving into explicit data that's coming up from someone's reference that says, I'm going to breach your protection measure, and I have data that says, in order to breach that measure, it's going to take me 8 seconds, or it's going to take me 15 consecutive attacks in a day, or whatever, my dedicated denial of service attack. These are where the thresholds come in that go past it. As long as I know what the mission there and that value is, that's where I have the chance to determine which extreme I need to work with. Normalize your data. Easier said than done. That's why data scientists, when they come out of school, make uber bucks. But someone still needs to define what it is. Consistently, if you're going to rate, make sure you're consistent and make sure and that you test your team with the same data in the same scenarios to make sure they're answering the exact same way. So if you're going to go with the scoring method and you're going to live in that middle world, make sure you're consistent. So at least you get to what John was showing is, which one of the target is. Everybody is grouped at the same place in the target. I just don't know if I'm in the middle or not. But at least I've got consistency. Analyze the value of your protection measures. Make sure that, are they truly implemented if you're going to take credit for them? And are they being used? Just because I have a 3/4 ton pickup truck gives me the capacity to load 6,000 pounds in the back of it without breaking the axle. However, do I know how to load it? Do I even ever use it? Those kinds of questions. Make sure you capture sufficient data so you're increasing your confidence level in the data and bringing that error band down smaller. And then analyze the data from different perspectives. If you're going to do a combined operations assessment, cyber assessment, risk assessment, and a physical assessment, and all you are is a physical security guy and you're the only, or team, and everyone comes in with the same perspective, then if you're anybody else, any place else but Colorado, since smoking dope is legal, I would say you're smoking dope. So bring in folks with that expertise so that when you come in, I'm going to bring Howard in on my assessment for that refinery, not because he's an expert in refining. I'm going to bring him in because he's a process guy for part of what I'm going to be working with. And those are the kinds of pieces that you've got to have that team that's bringing in different areas of expertise into that process, and you're analyzing that data the same way from multiple angles, so you try and not get the scatter plot that we showed up on the target, that your scatter plot starts converging in and moving into the same area because everyone is sort of pounding it in. The challenge in doing that is making sure that you don't get the groupthink that just says we're all converging on the same area, but it's the wrong area. So, yeah, I think that, so did I give you the answers?
No.
No, but I sure gave you all the lessons that I didn't learn, that we learned the hard way. And yes, we've developed our process to address these in a manner that continues to have to improve. Because the more we go in, everything has to be validated in. Otherwise, y'all are smart in your areas of expertise. Apply that and bring forth the best recommendations and sell it that way. That way, you're giving the best service to your end user so they can interpret it properly, as opposed to saying what you bring is gospel. When if you had to go to a congressional committee to defend it, could you defend it? And if you can't, then stick with, this is my opinion, and I can defend my opinion. I can do that all day long. But if I can't defend my process, you're probably using the wrong process. So, anybody else want to throw in? I've had a good time, so I'm happy. Everything else is up to y'all. And drinks are on the house, according to Ray, because you already paid for it.
Thank you.